The night they left him, the ice did not roar, it simply watched. And in that silence, Jonah Hale understood that some betrayals arrive not with shouting, but with the quiet closing of a door that never opens again. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from. He had seen the lights of the snowmobiles fade into the white distance, swallowed by blowing powder and the steady curtain of Arctic night, until they were nothing but ghosts in his memory. The storm had not yet broken, but the wind already tasted of it, sharp and metallic on his tongue, a promise of something worse crawling over the horizon. His hands shook as he adjusted the hood of his borrowed parka, fingers already too clumsy, knuckles reddened by cold that had slipped past his gloves and settled into bone. The ice beneath his boots creaked in slow complaint, a sound like an old ship straining. He turned around once, a full circle, hoping to see some sign that they had changed their minds, that this exile was a cruel joke that would end with someone waving, someone laughing, someone saying, "We're not really leaving you." No one came. The horizon remained a low, dark bruise, and the only movement was snow drifting sideways like white smoke. Jonah had not grown up with snow. He had grown up with heat that stuck to the skin, with asphalt, with humidity that made shirts cling and hair curl. Even after months in the north, even after safety trainings and cold weather drills and the bravado of men who believed themselves tougher than any landscape, his body still felt alien in this place. He had come with a survey crew, men paid to measure land and ice and possibilities. They talked about pipelines and shipping lanes and future ports, about what the Arctic could become for them, not what it already was to those who had lived here for generations. At first, he had believed their talk of teamwork, of brotherhood, of no man left behind. Those words felt heavy now, sagging in his chest the way his pack sagged against his spine, useless weight. Somewhere out there, his former team was huddled in heated tents, their boots drying, their coffee steaming, their jokes ricocheting off aluminum walls. He pictured them avoiding his name, as if not speaking it could erase what they had done. It had happened fast, a supply miscalculation, an argument about fuel, a rising wind that turned calm into danger in minutes. Someone had to stay back, they said. Someone had to wait with the broken machine until the weather passed and help could be sent, or until the weight of the sled could be reduced enough to move. The leader, hardened by years and other jobs like this, had looked at Jonah, the newest, the one who still hesitated before stepping onto thin ice, the one who asked too many questions about risks and safety. "You'll be fine," he had said, voice clipped, eyes already turned toward the route ahead. "You just wait here. We'll mark the coordinates. We'll come back as soon as we can." But there had been no GPS confirmation, no flares, no extra fuel left behind, only promises scattered like loose snow. Jonah had watched them go with a hollow tightness in his ribs, knowing even then that something was wrong, that their pace away from him was too eager, too light. Now, the cold walked into him like an intruder. It found the thin seam at his wrist where glove met sleeve, crawled up his forearms, sank into the spaces between his ribs and spine, whispered its slow thread along the back of his neck. His breath burned as it left his lungs and became white fog in front of his face, a momentary cloud that vanished as quickly as any hope he tried to gather. He checked his pockets again, though he already knew exactly what he had: a half-frozen energy bar, a small metal flask with water that was rapidly thickening to slush, a lighter, a knife, a short coil of cord, and a flare gun with only one red cartridge. He had a radio too, but its battery icon had already dipped dangerously low. The static he'd heard minutes ago was thinning, voices swallowed by distance and weather. He raised it once more, just in case, the device clumsy in his gloved hands. "Base, this is Jonah Hale," he said, voice trembling from more than cold. "Copy, anyone?" The reply was a sparse hiss, a smudge of sound that did not become language. Then the battery light died. For a moment, he simply stood there, feeling the weight of that small red symbol winking out. His throat tightened as if a hand had closed around it. All his life, he had believed that if he followed rules, worked hard, did not make too much noise, he would be safe, or at least not abandoned. He had stayed late at jobs, taken blame that wasn't his, smoothed things over for others. He had volunteered to come north because they said it was a good opportunity, that a season here could change his career, his finances, his future. He had not expected it to ask for his life. The realization that this ice might become his grave did not arrive as a scream, but as a low hum in his body, a knowledge settling under his skin like frost. He needed shelter. The thought came not as panic, but as something practical. The echo of training drilled into his mind. Move, don't stand still. He scanned the horizon again, looking for any break in the pale monotony, a rise of snow that might hide rocks, the shadow of sea ice pressure ridges, the faint outline of land. There a darker shape low to the ground, maybe a cluster of old ice pushed into jagged forms, maybe the edge of a frozen inlet. The distance was impossible to judge properly in that light. The gray sky pressed close to the white earth, flattening everything. Jonah forced his legs to move anyway. With each step, the snow dragged at his boots, sometimes firm, sometimes giving way, sending his weight shifting unevenly. The cold bit even harder when sweat began to form under his clothes, damp patches turning into icy blades against his skin. As he walked, the wind strengthened, pushing against his chest, grabbing at his hood, making the fur ruff tremble. Snowflakes thickened, not soft like the flurries he remembered from childhood trips to colder cities, but small shards that stung the skin when they found it. The sound of the world narrowed to the crunch of his boots and the low rush of air past his ears. Time blurred. He measured it not in minutes, but in how often he had to stop to breathe, to bend slightly and brace his hands against his knees, to fight the dizziness that came with too little food and too much fear. The dark shape ahead of him grew with painful slowness, never quite as close as he wanted it to be. More than once, he thought he saw movement in the corner of his vision, a figure, a flicker, a shadow, but when he turned his head, there was only snow. By the time he reached the cluster of pressure ridges, his legs trembled with each step. The ice here had been shoved upward long ago, frozen waves of blue-white that leaned into one another like toppled statues. Cracks ran between them, narrow canyons protected from the worst of the wind, where snow had gathered in softer drifts. He slipped down into one of those small hollows, grateful for even the slight reduction in wind that hit his body. The sky above was still a bruised gray, but here, between walls of ice, the world felt quieter. He dropped his pack in the snow and knelt beside it, hands fumbling with the zipper. He had a thin emergency blanket somewhere, reflective and noisy, something meant for disaster kits and obligated safety measures. When he found it and shook it open, the metallic crinkle sounded absurdly loud in the empty landscape. He wrapped it around his torso under the parka, its cold surface warming just a little as it trapped what little heat his body still made. Starting a fire on ice was a lesson his crew had talked about but never had to practice seriously. Jonah now wished they had. He remembered fragments. Dig down, find something solid, use the sled, use rocks, never build on bare ice unless you want it to melt beneath you. There were no rocks here, only snow and frozen ocean. He scraped at the snow anyway, hands clawing at it, breath coming in uneven bursts. He managed to uncover a patch of older, harder ice that felt steadier, less like a crust over something hollow. Using slats from a broken crate he had insisted on taking when the others left it had seemed useless at the time, extra weight they had mocked, he fashioned a small, shaky platform. His fingers fought him when he tried to work the lighter, thumb slipping, metal stubborn. After 3 attempts, a spark caught, a small flame licked at the brittle wood. He leaned over it, cupping his hands to shield it from the wind, talking to it under his breath as if it were a skittish animal. Come on, stay, please. The fire grew reluctantly, a thin tongue of orange among so much white and blue. Smoke rose in delicate threads that vanished quickly in the moving air, but the heat was real, a faint brush against his face and palms. Jonah held his hands out, feeling the sting of returning sensation, that painful transition between numb and alive that made him grit his teeth. His cheeks burned, his nose dripped, his eyes watered, not just from the smoke. The tiny circle of warmth did not erase the cold around him, but it pushed it back by a few inches, gave him a center point, a reason to stay upright. "You're okay," he muttered to himself, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "You just have to last the night. They'll come back. Someone will come." Yet even as he said it, another thought slid in, quieter, more honest. The people who had left him here had already decided what his life was worth. He did not know how long he sat there, hunched over the little fire, listening to the crackle of wood and the far-off, almost musical groan of shifting ice. Shadows moved across the sky as the wind reshaped the storm clouds, turning them from flat gray to something layered, almost sculpted. The sense of being watched grew with every passing moment, not the paranoid feeling of a city street at night, but something older, slower, like the land itself was aware. He remembered a conversation he had overheard months ago, when he had first arrived in the north, between two local hunters and an elder woman whose age seemed woven into the lines of her hands. She had spoken softly, but with a certainty that made everyone else listen. "The ice remembers how we walk on it," she had said. "It watches how we treat one another. It knows who leaves and who stays." At the time, Jonah had smiled politely, unsure how to carry those words. Tonight, alone in this hollow of ice, they settled into him with new weight. The first sound he heard that did not belong to storm or fire was almost too faint to notice, a soft crunch, different from his own earlier stumbling, measured and deliberate. He froze, head tilted, listening. Another crunch, closer this time, accompanied by the faint swish of something brushing against snow. His hand went automatically to the knife at his belt, not because he believed it would save him from anything serious, but because the gesture made him feel less helpless. Shapes moved at the edge of his vision again, but this time, when he looked up, one of them did not vanish. A figure stood at the top of the ice ridge, framed against the dim sky, a tall silhouette wrapped in fur and hide, with a hood lined in pale fur that caught what little light remained. For a heartbeat, Jonah thought he was hallucinating, another trick of exhausted eyes. Then the figure moved with quiet purpose, climbing down toward him with a grace that belonged more to the land than to any city he had known. Snow crunched softly under her boots as she approached, each step sure and unhurried despite the uneven ice. The closer she came, the more details emerged: the heavy caribou parka stitched with care, the bough slung across her back, the knife at her hip, the long braids that had slipped free of her hood and lay dark against her chest. Her presence seemed to bend the cold slightly, not because the air was warmer, but because his awareness of it shifted. His attention moved from his own pain to the deliberate way she moved, the way her gaze took in everything at once: the fire, the crate pieces, the tremor in his hands, the way his shoulders hunched not just from the cold but from something older, like a man braced for impact. When she stopped a few steps away, the world narrowed to the small space between them, where the fire painted gold onto her boots and the lower edge of her coat. For a long moment, she said nothing, and neither did he. The wind spoke instead, threading between them, tugging at the loose strands of her hair, lifting a corner of the emergency blanket that peeked from his parka. Her eyes, dark and steady, studied his face with a focus that made him feel even more exposed than his half-frozen hands. She saw the bruised red of his cheeks, the cracked skin at the corners of his mouth, the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. She saw the kind of fear that takes up residence not just in the body, but in the memory. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, carrying the calm of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "They left you," she said, not as a question, but as a simple statement that cut through all his attempts to disguise what had happened. The words landed like a diagnosis in a cold room. He tried to swallow, but his throat was dry. Jonah nodded once, the movement small and stiff. He opened his mouth to explain, to defend, to say something that would make him sound less like a man who had simply been discarded, but the words tangled with the knot in his chest. They said they'd come back," he managed, the sentence unraveling on the last word. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, hoarse and thin, scraped by cold air and swallowed panic. He hated how it made him sound like a boy rather than the grown man he was. The woman's gaze did not flinch, did not soften into pity, did not harden into contempt. It stayed steady, as if she were measuring his truth against something older than either of them. She glanced once toward the direction where his crew had disappeared, then back at him, as if making some quiet calculation. In another place, he might have tried to stand taller, to square his shoulders and pretend that he was fine, that he didn't need anyone. Here, on this ice that held the memory of every step, pretense felt useless. The fire crackled quietly between them, its small, fragile heat the only witness. Jonah realized that he was shivering again, not just from cold now, but from the sudden presence of another human being after so many hours alone with his thoughts. There was something in her posture, a stillness that was not rigid, a calm that did not come from indifference that made him feel seen in a way that was unfamiliar and unsettling. If his former crew had looked at him like a replaceable part, this woman looked at him like a situation to be understood before judgment was passed. In that gaze was danger and possibility both. She stepped a fraction closer, enough that he could see the subtle patterns stitched into her parka, lines and shapes that spoke of hands, who knew the stories of this land. The ice remembers, she said quietly, echoing words he had heard once before from an elder, though he did not yet know that connection. It does not forget who is abandoned on it. The sentence hung in the air between them, heavy with meanings he could not yet fully grasp. Then, with a movement that was both practical and oddly intimate in its simplicity, she extended one gloved hand toward him, palm up, as if offering him not just help, but entry into a different kind of world, one where his survival would depend not on the promises of men who had left, but on the choices of this woman who had stayed. Jonah stared at her extended hand for longer than he should have, not because he doubted her intention, but because something in that gesture felt heavier than simple assistance. In the dim firelight, her glove looked carved from darkness itself, steady and unyielding, while his own hand trembled with the cold that had burrowed deep beneath the layers of his clothes. When he finally reached toward her, his fingers brushed the edge of her palm, and the contact, brief, gloved, and softened by first, sent a ripple of warmth through his arm that startled him. It was not heat in the literal sense, not yet, but something like the memory of heat waking inside him after too many hours of freezing loneliness. She closed her hand around his and lifted him with effortless strength, as though his weight were as insignificant to her as wind-blown snow. When he stood fully, their height difference became undeniable. She wasn't merely tall, she was imposing in a way that felt ancestral, like a figure carved into a cliffside to watch over a village. Her presence filled the narrow hollow between the pressure ridges. Jonah felt as though the world itself had shrunk to hold only the space shared between their breaths. The fire cast a soft amber glow on her cheekbones and jawline, revealing sharp contours shaped by weather and discipline, but also something softer, something he had not expected to find in a stranger's face, a quiet, simmering concern. Not pity, not fear. Concern, the kind that made warmth stir somewhere beneath his ribs, a dangerous place for warmth to bloom. She stepped around him, examining the small fire, the crate remnants, the unstable ice beneath. Jonah tried to speak, but words kept faltering against the tightness in his throat. She placed one gloved hand near the flame not to warm it, but to test its strength, then looked back at him with an expression that suggested she knew more about him in 5 seconds than his entire survey team had cared to learn in months. The wind shifted, pulling her coat open just enough for him to glimpse more of the elaborate stitching along the inner seams, lines that traced stories he couldn't read, stories that belonged to generations before him. When she turned fully, her face was lit by fire on one side and shadow on the other, an image so striking it rooted him where he stood. "You will not survive the night here," she said. There was no accusation in her voice, just truth. "Your body is already losing the battle." Jonah swallowed, tasting the metallic dryness on his tongue. He knew she was right. The tremors in his hands had changed from sharp to sluggish, the kind that came from deeper cold settling into nerve and marrow. He tried to answer with something coherent, but his voice cracked. I didn't think they'd really leave." The admission escaped him before he could guard it. She studied him for a long moment, not surprised, not judging, just watching the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of a truth spoken out loud for the first time. Without warning, she stepped closer, far closer than any stranger should. Her height made the movement feel enveloping, almost protective, as though he had stepped into the shadow of something ancient. She reached for the edge of his hood, tugging it down slightly, examining his forehead, his cheeks, the raw pink of frostbite beginning to bloom. Her fingers, though still gloved, brushed the sensitive skin near his temple, and the touch sent a pulse of awareness through him, sharp, intimate, and startling in its simplicity. It wasn't flirtation, it was assessment, but something in the firmness of her touch, the certainty of it, awakened a part of him that had been numb long before the cold tried to claim him. "You are freezing from the inside," she murmured. "Your fire is small." Too small. Jonah let out a breath he had been holding without realizing it. Her phrasing "your fire" settled into him with unexpected weight, as though she were speaking about more than body heat. She turned her attention to the fire, then to the wind that sliced across the ridge. "This flame will not last, and your body will stop fighting soon." He nodded weakly. What should I do? The question sounded childish in his ears, but he could not take it back. She looked up at him again, and this time her gaze softened not in sympathy, but in recognition, as though she had seen men ask this same question before, at the edge of survival. In the next moment, she did something that stole the remaining air from his lungs. She grasped his arm firmly, just above the elbow, and pulled him toward her with a decisiveness that allowed no room for hesitation. He stumbled forward, his chest brushing the front of her parka, the heat radiating from her body startlingly intense compared to the frozen world around them. She was warm deep, living warm, the kind of warmth that felt like it came from muscle, blood, breath, fire. He inhaled instinctively, and the scent of her coat smoke, hide, faint traces of spruce resin filled his senses, grounding him. She lowered her voice, and the tone shifted subtly, carrying something that made the back of his neck prickle. "You need heat," she said. "Real heat, not wood that burns out in minutes." Their faces were close now, the fire crackling at their feet, the wind pressing snow against the walls of the ridge. Jonah felt the tremor in his legs begin to ease simply from standing near her. She was a fortress of warmth, a hearth disguised as a warrior. Without thinking, he whispered, "Why help me?" Her expression changed in a way he couldn't decipher. Something flickered behind her eyes, a memory or a choice or a cost. "Because the ice remembers who is abandoned," she said softly. "And I do not leave men to die." Her grip tightened slightly, not enough to hurt, just enough to steady him. The closeness between them grew heavier, not quite dangerous but undeniably charged, like the moment before stepping inside a shelter where the air still holds heat from someone else's body. The wind howled above them, filling the gap of silence. Jonah realized with a strange, slow clarity that no one had ever stood this close to him with such calm authority, such unspoken understanding of what his body needed. Then she drew him even nearer, their breaths mingling in small clouds that drifted upward. His chest pressed fully against her torso, and the contact unlocked a warmth he had forgotten his body could feel. His fingers, numb and clumsy, brushed against the thick fur at her shoulder, and the sensation was so startlingly soft beneath his glove that it nearly buckled his knees. She leaned slightly, subtly, so that her height shielded him from the wind, her warmth enclosing him the way a winter hearth encloses flame. "You will walk with me," she murmured, her voice low enough that he felt it more than heard it. "My shelter is far, but my warmth will keep your fire alive until we reach it." Jonah nodded, not trusting his voice. Her meaning was practical survival, body heat, shared warmth, but the subtext echoed somewhere deeper, someplace that made heat rise in his chest even as the world around them froze. As she guided his hand toward the front of her parka, positioning it where her body radiated the most heat, Jonah's breath hitched, not in fear, but in a stunned, involuntary reaction to the intimacy of the gesture. It was survival, it was necessary, but it was also something else, something shaped by the unique gravity of two strangers whose loneliness had collided in the cold. Her voice brushed his ear, warm despite the wind. "Stay close, let my fire reach yours." And without another word, she began to lead him out of the hollow, her body heat enveloping him as snow swirled around their joint steps. The storm tightened around them as she led him across the frozen ridges, her hand gripping his arm with an authority that steadied his shaking steps. Jonah tried to keep pace, but his legs had grown heavy, sluggish, each movement slowed by cold that had already begun carving itself into his muscles. Yet every time he faltered, she adjusted her stride without a word, her body heat radiating through the space between them like a pulsing ember. The world shrank to the sound of their boots, the hiss of wind scraping across the ice, and the slow, deliberate rhythm of her breath guiding his. He followed her through the storm not because he trusted the land, but because his body had begun trusting her the way warmth bled from her presence and wrapped around him like something instinctual, older than either of them could name. Her shelter appeared out of the white like a secret the ice had tried to hide, a low, sturdy cabin built from driftwood and weathered timbers, strengthened with the curved ribs of a whale long returned to the sea. Smoke rose from a carved vent in a thin, wavering line, the only sign of softness in the brutal expanse. The snow had piled against its sides like the Arctic itself had tried to swallow it, but the structure held its ground, defiant and alone. When she pushed open the heavy door, warm air spilled out immediately, striking Jonah's frozen skin with such force he gasped, his lungs forgetting how to react to heat after so many hours in the cold. She guided him inside with a firm hand on his back. The door shut behind them, muting the howling wind to a muffled distant roar. For a long moment, Jonah could only stand there, swaying slightly, stunned by the shock of warmth wrapping around him. The cabin's interior glowed with amber light, a wide hearth made of stone and whalebone burned with a steady, deep flame, Racks of drying fish hung near the ceiling. Fur-lined benches circled the walls. Carved tools rested in shadowed corners. Everything felt lived in, sturdy, and infused with a sense of presence that went beyond the woman who owned it. "You're safe now," she said, voice low but no longer edged with ice. She touched his elbow, guiding him closer to the hearth. "Sit. Your body must remember how to thaw." Jonah sank onto a fur-covered bench, the heat seeping into him so quickly that his eyes stung. She knelt in front of him not out of deference, but out of necessity, the way someone kneels to tend a fire. Her gloved hands reached for his sleeves, tugging them open, assessing the stiffness in his arms. Steam rose from his skin as the frost on his clothing began to melt. He felt clumsy and exposed, his breath unsteady, as she worked with deliberate care. When she removed one glove, the shift in the room's energy was immediate. Her bare hand was strong, calloused from bowstring and blade, yet radiating heat that felt almost unreal to him. She placed her palm against the back of his hand tentatively at first, then with firmer pressure, and Jonah inhaled sharply, the kind of breath one takes not from pain, but from the shock of feeling returning to fast. Her skin against his did more than warm him. It steadied him, grounded him, pulled him back from the edge of that quiet numbness he had begun to accept as fate. "You have fought the cold alone for too long," she murmured, eyes traveling across the lines of his face, reading exhaustion and lingering disbelief like markings on ice. "Your fire was fading." Jonah swallowed, his voice raw when he tried to speak. "I didn't know if I would make it." She didn't reassure him with empty words. Instead, she pressed his hands gently between her own, creating a small shelter for them, trapping heat, as if she were coaxing flame from dying embers. As minutes passed, Jonah became increasingly aware of their proximity. Her knees brushed his boots, her breathing synchronized with his, her presence filling the space so completely that he felt the edges of himself blur. Sweat began to bead at his temples as his body thawed too quickly, forcing him to lean forward, elbows on his knees, head lowered as dizziness washed through him. She moved closer without hesitation, one hand steadying his shoulder as the other pushed damp hair away from his forehead. Her fingers were warm, even warmer than the fire, and he leaned into her touch instinctively, unable to hide the way his body sought her heat. "Easy," she whispered. "Thawing can hurt more than freezing." He nodded, eyes closed, breath shaking. Heat rushed through his limbs, mixing with the unspoken tension suspended between them. She studied him with a curious intensity, as if trying to understand the man who had appeared on her ice like a fallen star. And then, with a slow exhale that seemed to carry the weight of winters he had never known, she said the words that would echo through him long after the storm outside had died. "No man has ever touched my fire." He opened his eyes, breath caught in his throat. She held his gaze steadily, unflinching, as though she were revealing something not meant for the world outside. "Many have shared my hunts," she continued softly. "Some have shared my shelter, but none." Her fingers brushed the inside of his wrist, barely a touch, more a promise of warmth than the warmth itself. "None have reached the place where my fire lives." Jonah's pulse throbbed under her fingertip. Heat surged through him that had nothing to do with survival. She wasn't speaking of romance in the ordinary sense, nor desire in a way that violated the boundaries of her culture. She was speaking of something quieter, deeper, the part of herself that thawed only for those who had earned it. He swallowed hard, the cabin shrinking around them, the firelight turning her features into sculpture and shadow. "Why tell me?" he whispered. Her answer came not as a statement, but as a quiet confession. "Because tonight, I felt your fire reaching for mine." The words settled between them like embers landing on dry kindling, and Jonah realized, with a clarity that frightened and steadied him both, that he was warming for the first time in years, not just in body, but in the place inside him that had frozen long before he ever stepped onto Arctic ice. The storm raged through the night, fierce enough to make the timbers of the cabin tremble, but inside, the world narrowed to a pocket of amber warmth where Jonah and the Huntress existed in a silence that felt chosen, not empty. The fire cast shifting patterns across the walls, lines of smoke-darkened wood, the curves of the whale bones, the slow rise and fall of pelts stirred by heat. Jonah's breathing had steadied, but his body still hummed with the lingering shock of thawing, each pulse of returning warmth blending with the awareness of her so close beside him. She had not moved far since confessing her truth. She sat near the fire, long legs folded with warrior grace, one shoulder brushing his whenever he leaned forward to adjust his breath. He watched her hands broad, sure, marked by years of weather and work, move across a pot suspended over the flame. She stirred something thick and steaming, a mixture of broth, bone, and herbs that filled the room, with a scent so comforting it nearly undid him. Hunger hit him suddenly, sharp and humbling, reminding him how long his body had gone without fuel. She glanced at him as if she felt the shift in his breath. Without a word, she filled a bowl and set it before him, the gesture gentle but firm, the same way she had steadied him on the ice. "Eat," she said. "Warmth must come from inside, too." Jonah obeyed, though his hands trembled when he lifted the bowl. The heat soaked into his palms, then into his chest as he ate. Every swallow seemed to unravel another knot of cold inside him. She watched him quietly, not with scrutiny, but with the patience of someone who understood the fragile process of returning to oneself after survival steals the edges of a person. Only when his bowl was nearly empty did she finally speak. "You were not just abandoned," she said. "You were discarded." Her tone held no pity, only a precise recognition of injury, the kind that sits beneath skin long after bruises fade. Jonah looked down into his bowl. I've felt that before, long before the ice." She nodded once, as if she had already seen the truth in him before he spoke it. Then she reached forward and touched the center of his chest with two warm fingers just above the sternum, where his breath rose unevenly. The contact was light but devastating, as though she had tapped directly against the place where he hid the oldest wounds. "This is where the cold began," she murmured. "Not outside, here." Jonah exhaled shakily, unable to hold her gaze for a moment. He hadn't expected her to understand him so quickly, so accurately. The touch lingered a fraction longer, enough for heat to gather under her fingertips. Then she pulled her hand back and rested it on her thigh, her eyes never leaving him. For a long time, neither spoke. The fire popped softly, sending sparks swirling toward the vent. Jonah's heart felt too full and too fragile at once, stretched between gratitude, exhaustion, and an ache that surprised him with its clarity. He had never expected warmth from a stranger. And he had never imagined that the first warm place he found after years of quiet freezing would be in the presence of a woman carved from winter herself. When she finally shifted closer, her movement was slow, deliberate, as though she were approaching not a wounded man, but a skittish animal who had been hurt one too many times. She sat beside him on the bench, their hips barely an inch apart, though the closeness felt more intimate than a touch. Her presence radiated real heat, not the imagined kind, and when their shoulders brushed, Jonah felt the last remnants of cold melt from the back of his ribs. She kept her eyes on the fire when she spoke next, as if the flames could carry her meaning more courageously than her voice alone. "My fire," she said softly, "does not open easily." The confession hung in the air, quiet but heavy. Not for strength, not for skill, not for those who seek warmth without offering their own. Jonah turned to her slowly, the heat of her body seeping into his side. "Why open it for me?" The question came out rough, unguarded, edged with disbelief. She finally met his eyes, and there was nothing guarded in her expression now, only a directness that made his pulse stutter. "Because you came to the ice already broken," she said. "And yet, when you saw my warmth, you reached toward it. Not to take, to survive." She lifted her hand, hesitated a heartbeat, then placed it over his, skin to skin this time. Her palm was hot, shockingly, beautifully hot, and he felt the warmth travel up his arm like rising fire. "No man has ever touched my fire," she said again, but this time there was no distance in her voice, no barrier between meaning and feeling. "But tonight, you did." Jonah's breath caught. She leaned slightly closer, not a move of possession, but of invitation, subtle, restrained, offering space for him to choose whether to meet her in the warmth she extended. The intimacy was not the intimacy of hunger, nor lust, nor desperation. It was something deeper, anchored in survival and recognition, the way two flames grow stronger when brought near. Jonah lifted his hand and covered hers gently, not gripping, just matching her warmth with his own. She inhaled quietly, a sound he almost missed, but it shifted the air between them. Her thumb brushed the back of his hand in a gesture so small and so deliberate that it felt like the beginning of something neither of them needed to name. The storm outside howled one last time, its strength waning, and the fire inside the cabin crackled louder, as though approving the exchange. Jonah felt the strangest mixture of safety and vulnerability, as if the warmth surrounding him now might reshape parts of him he had let freeze for years. When dawn finally began pressing pale light against the edges of the storm, she rose and tightened the fur at her shoulders. Jonah stood too, unexpectedly steady on his feet. She studied him with that same penetrating calm, then nodded once, a gesture of acceptance, not dismissal. "You will walk out of this cabin alive," she said. "Not because I saved you. Because you chose to burn again." Jonah felt heat bloom in his chest, hotter than any fire. "I wouldn't have made it without you," he whispered. She stepped closer, her breath brushing the air between them. "And I would not have opened my fire without you." The words settled like the final ember of a long night. As they stepped outside together into the quiet, newly bright world, Jonah knew the truths with startling clarity. He had not just survived the Arctic, he had been transformed by the woman who walked beside him, the huntress whose fire he had touched, and who had quietly touched his in return.